we've seen that Putin, he often engages in nuclear signaling. It's something he's done really from the outset of the war. So I think that in response to this White House firmness that we've now seen, Putin, of course, turns to his weapons. It's no coincidence.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got journalist and commentator Bethany Elliott on the show, and just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Bethany, thank you so much for joining the show again.
Hi, Maddie. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to start off with, of course, what's happened in the last few days with the US and China have agreed on this one-year truce. They've signed a trade deal that talks about tariffs and fentanyl, rare earths, and establishing a framework for future trade and improving the sale of TikTok's US operations to an American buyer. So under the agreement, both sides will suspend investigations and countermeasures, with the US reducing certain tariffs and China pledging to adjust its own in response. So specifically, we saw Donald Trump agree to drop tariffs on Chinese goods from 57% to 47%. So Bethany, can you walk me through this signed deal? We didn't really know if Donald Trump would actually walk away with a deal, but he has. So is it fair for both sides?
Absolutely. Xi and Trump met in South Korea, where they were both attending the APEC forum. The meeting between them went on for about 90 minutes. It was their first meeting since 2019, so the first during Trump's second term. So a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations on that. But Trump called Xi a leader of a great country, and so they will have a fantastic relationship for a long period of time. Xi was a bit more muted. He said it's natural the US and China don't always see eye to eye, and it's normal for the two leading economies to have frictions now and then. But we saw that Trump was super happy with the meeting. He said it was an amazing meeting. He rated it as a 12 out of 10, which does feel a bit like this is Spinal Tap. This meeting went all the way up to a 12. Whether it actually merits that huge reaction from Trump, well, that remains to be seen because, as you say, Trump said the US is cutting tariffs on China by 10% in exchange for a promise by China to take very strong action on those chemicals used to produce fentanyl. And he said that after the reduction, US tariffs on Chinese imports will be 47%. China promised to ease some of the controls it imposed on exports of processed rare earth minerals for 1 year. So that's good news for American enterprises. China also agreed to resume purchase of soybeans, so that's good news for American farmers. The US also agreed to put on hold for 1 year a move to apply export restrictions to certain subsidiaries of already blacklisted Chinese entities. However, there are some bits here that are missing, particularly on the sort of geopolitical sphere. They didn't discuss Taiwan. Trump was quite clear on that. There had been worries that Trump might make some concessions over Taiwan, might sell them out, but he claimed that it never came up. They did also discuss Ukraine. Trump said that they had talked about that. He said they agreed to work together to see if we can get that war finished, and we talked about it for a long time. Although that was a bit worrying in itself, because he said sometimes you have to let them fight. So does that mean that the Ukraine war is just going to go on for a while now? Can Xi be persuaded to use his influence to get Trump to the negotiating table? Is Xi just placating Trump? A lot remains to be seen. And I think that Trump said he'd visit China in April for follow-up talks and that Xi will also visit the US. So the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. For all of Trump's effusiveness, this does seem to be more of a temporary truce than a grand reset. It didn't tackle the big issues like Taiwan, and I don't think it fundamentally changed the dynamic between the two countries. Even within the economic sphere, they're still competing over AI. Their economies are decoupling in many sectors. This doesn't change the dynamic between them fundamentally. So a lot depends on what happens now, what China does about fentanyl. Additionally, China put in export controls on rare earths back in April and enhanced those in October. But there is speculation that China might delay the new export rules, but maintain those it introduced earlier. So a lot remains to be seen for all of Trump's happiness and effusiveness.
There was a little bit of criticism after the meeting. As you mentioned, Donald Trump said it was a 12 out of 10, but many critics believed that that was not the case. We saw Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer say it was a total dud. He said it was only necessary because Trump had created a mess and now he wants to take credit for pretending like he fixed it. While a Georgetown professor also told Al Jazeera that it was just a pause and a small rollback in the trade war. Both sides have not given up their trade weapons, but merely have agreed to stop firing as long as both sides hold to the agreements. Is that your interpretation of it, Bethany, that it not only was it a total dud, but it was kind of not exactly giving up their weapons, but kind of remaining at a truce, as you mentioned?
Exactly, a temporary truce. A lot of these things are for 1 year. We'll have to see what happens, but I think that Trump just wanted to have a deal. We know he's obsessed with the art of the deal, as he calls it, so he just wanted to walk away with something.
One of the things that I thought was interesting is that Donald Trump, he told reporters that China would potentially start buying American oil soon. We've seen him want to put pressure on not just China but India in terms of the purchase of cheap Russian oil. We saw him slap tariffs on India for this, but spare China that. So do you see this happening? Because, you know, even Trump said that he was potentially going to get India to stop buying oil, but that doesn't seem to have happened.
No, that doesn't seem to have happened. He was talking about the possibility, as you say, of this oil project involving Alaska with China, but I don't think it's entirely likely. Back when there were talks in August with Putin in Alaska, there was even some speculation that Trump might be open to some kind of oil extraction deal there, and that didn't come to anything. So we know that Trump likes to talk a good job, but whether it comes to anything remains to be seen.
Before the trade war really kicked off in 2018, it was argued that this tariff system wasn't balanced, so that Donald Trump basically had a reason as to why he started this. So American exporters were facing higher barriers in China than Chinese exporters did in the US. So the tariffs were tilting in China's favor. So has Trump's reignited trade war with China in his second term in office failed in his attempt to use these tariffs as bargaining chips with other countries such as China? In other words, do you think his tariff war has failed?
Well, to assess if it's failed, we have to know what's winning. He wanted manufacturing back in the US. Geopolitically, Trump has received concessions from other countries. He has been able to have countries chasing after him for deals. But there are consequences to this trade war. The Economist ran a really interesting article saying that there is pain in parts of America's economy due to this. The prices of durable goods rose by over 3%, an annual rate in the second quarter of 2025. That was the fastest since the early 90s, if you exclude COVID. And there are estimates that the tariffs are adding around 0.3 percentage points to inflation. So there isn't runaway inflation. Consumers are spending. Perhaps one reason for that is that the tariffs are slightly gentler than advertised. In April, America's average rate was estimated to be in 30%. Today, the same models put it closer to 18%. You could argue perhaps that Trump's trade war was always a bit too scatterbrained. Businesses right from the outset were complaining about a lack of information and not knowing the end game.
How much are both sides, the US and China, willing to give each other? Because the more they give each other, the more powerful and resourceful the other country becomes.
I agree with you entirely. It's hard to say what they're willing to give each other. I think that we've seen a lot of bargaining with this recent deal, but this is a temporary truce. This is not a grand reset. So it's hard to assess what the US and China are really willing to give each other.
Do you think Xi was telling Trump that he's not willing to back down?
Yes, I think he may have been doing that, yeah.
What did you make of the fact that only minutes before Donald Trump was set to meet with Xi, he wrote on social media that he had ordered the Pentagon to start nuclear weapons testing at the same level as China and Russia?
It's really interesting. The timing was very interesting. It was only minutes before he met with Xi. It also wasn't clear if Trump was referring to the testing of nuclear warheads or the missiles and other delivery systems that carried them. He didn't explain why, but when asked, he did say it wasn't about China. He said it has to do with the others. They seem to all be nuclear testing. The US last conducted a nuclear weapons test in 1992. It's joined Russia and China in observing a decades-long moratorium on underground nuclear blasts. I do think there is some context to this involving Russia, however, because on Sunday, Russia announced the successful test of a nuclear-powered cruise missile called the Burevestnik, which it says can carry a nuclear warhead, travel for more than 8,000 miles. On Monday, Trump said Putin should be ending the Ukraine war, not testing missiles. He said the tests were not appropriate. And then yesterday, Putin came out and said that Russia had successfully tested a Poseidon nuclear-propelled torpedo drone, which sounds very Bond villainish. And Putin had said that there is nothing like this in the world in terms of its speed and the depth of its movement, and there are no ways to intercept it. And he didn't say where it was launched or how far, just that it travelled for a certain amount of time. And we know about this Poseidon weapon. It's a new category of retaliatory weapon with a nuclear warhead capable of triggering, allegedly, a radioactive tsunami, which could hit coastal cities. The idea is it gets launched from a submarine like a torpedo, but the belief is that it can then lurk as an underwater drone and then attack. So there had been a glimpse of it back on Russian state TV in 2015. However, there were doubts about its existence. And then in 2018, it was one of 6 new arms that Putin mentioned in his State of the Nation address. So I think that it might be related to talking to Xi because of the timing. But I think also that Trump will have Putin and Russia on his mind. In terms of why Putin is doing this now, I think it's a bid to put pressure on the West and Ukraine to make concessions. It's part of Russia making maximalist demands, as we've seen in the past regarding the war. And Putin has engaged in nuclear threats throughout this conflict in an attempt to dissuade the West from supporting Ukraine. And also, it's a response to that firmer tone that we've seen from the White House. There was talk of a meeting between Trump and Putin in Budapest that got cancelled after the phone call between the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio, and then Trump called on Russia and Ukraine to free the front lines. Lavrov rejected an immediate ceasefire, saying it contradicted understandings that they'd reached back in Alaska in August. And then the US sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's two largest oil companies, and that was the first instance of the Trump administration imposing fresh sanctions on Russia. And then on October the 26th, the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent referred to the Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev as a Russian propagandist, after Dmitriev has said that the sanctions wouldn't affect the Russian economy and would only drive up US gas prices. I mean, he is a Russian propagandist. So the Russian political analyst Dmitry Trenin was saying that the Kremlin has been unable to convey to the White House how it sees the war. And so this diplomatic operation, as he phrased it, to convince Trump and get him on side, is now over. So we've seen very quickly how a war of words, how cancelled meetings have gone into Russian nuclear signaling, and then a US reaction. It's a much more dangerous and worrying nuclear environment. But we know how Trump flits back and forth between the Ukrainian side, Russian talking points, so it's still very open.
So you think Putin's announcement of the Poseidon was definitely a stern message being sent to Donald Trump?
Absolutely. We've seen that Putin, he often engages in nuclear signaling. It's something he's done really from the outset of the war. So I think that in response to this White House firmness that we've now seen, Putin, of course, turns to his weapons. It's no coincidence.
Just wrapping up Xi and Donald Trump's meeting, Bethany, do you think this is the end of this trade war until next year, or do you think we'll see more?
I think it's the end of the trade war until next year. Trump does seem very happy, and there's going to be these follow-up meetings in April. So I think that's the next step. That's the next time we'll really concentrate on this.
Trump was busy this week on his Asian tour. He also announced that the United States and South Korea had reached a trade agreement. It is yet to be signed, though, so it reportedly includes these reciprocal tariffs to be reduced from 25% to 15% and a $350 billion investment from South Korea into the United States. So was this a huge win from Donald Trump?
It was a good win, and it was interesting because expectations had actually been quite low. And also Trump at one stage said they'd reached a deal, then he walked it back, said they nearly finalised a deal. It was slightly unclear at first. A framework agreement had been reached back in July. However, Korea had really struggled with Washington's demands for upfront cash payments, so that it could destabilise its currency. So South Korea has agreed to invest $350 billion in the US. In return, the US will lower tariffs on car imports from 25% to 15%. And that's a really big deal because vehicles accounted for a third of South Korean exports to the US last year. $200 billion will be invested in cash, annual investments capped at $20 billion, and profits split between the two countries until the initial investment's been recouped. And then $150 billion relates to a shipbuilding partnership. Trump is very interested in South Korea's expertise in shipbuilding. So now Korea is saying that it will invest its money in projects that are commercially reasonable. It won't invest as a lump sum up front, but it'll spread the money out based on progress in those projects. And the idea is to thereby minimise the impact on Korea's foreign currency market. So yeah, it is a very big deal, but I think it's interesting in terms of the diplomacy as well, because it wasn't all trade. With Trump being there, the Koreans really went on the charm offensive with Trump. They gave him a gold crown. It's a replica of one from the Silla dynasty. And Trump said, I'd like to wear it right now. So we're seeing that the Koreans have perhaps looked at the state visit that Trump had to the UK and saw his obsession with royalty and thought, well, we have to dig back into our own past and see what we can give him. And the menu for the meal was focused on the friendship between the nations, and there were gold brownies. So this has definitely been Korea's strategy. Back in August, the president, Lee Jae-myung, said he'd read Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, in a bid to avoid what he'd termed a Zelensky moment of basically being yelled at. So that does seem to be working for him. They got this deal, and the charm offensive does seem to be going quite well for Korea.
Speaking of tariffs and sticking on that with what's actually happening with Canada. So right now the average tariff on Canadian goods entering the US is around 35%. So it does vary by product, but the baseline was 25% from March when Donald Trump invoked them, plus a 10% surcharge that Trump announced just a few days ago. But what's interesting about this situation is on Wednesday, the US Senate voted 50 to 46, including 4 Republicans, Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski to repeal Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian imports, arguing that they were harming American industries. But this move is largely symbolic because it still needs to pass the House and the president still has veto power, so unlikely to approve it. But what does this show, do you think, Bethany, about how US lawmakers are feeling about these tariffs?
Yeah, as you say, the Senate passed this resolution aimed at ending President Trump's tariffs on Canada, and those four Republicans, Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Mitch McConnell, joined Democrats in a 50-46 vote. And they had previously voted to block the Canada tariffs back in April. And it also came a day after they voted to terminate tariffs on Brazil. So the idea is to end the tariffs by terminating an emergency declaration from the president. Yeah, as you say, it's a symbolic rebuke. It isn't expected to be taken up by the House. Earlier this year, House Republicans moved to block members from being able to force a vote on the president's tariffs in the near future. But it does show a great deal of dis-ease about tariffs and about the US position on the part of some Republicans.
Moving on to more of a domestic front, Donald Trump, he's been asked in the last few days on his tour about his thoughts on running for a third term. It's become a bit of a comical thing that he keeps being asked about. He told reporters on Wednesday that if you read it, it's pretty clear that I'm not allowed to run. It's too bad, referring to the Constitution, of course, which allows presidents to run for 3 terms. While earlier in the week, he said it was too cute of an idea, which was an idea for him to run as the vice president on someone else's ticket, and then for whoever that person is, maybe J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio in the top seat, for them to resign. So a bit of an extravagant idea that was put to Donald Trump, which he basically said, no, that's too cute. So do you think Donald Trump has given up on the idea of running for a third term, essentially changing the Constitution? It's a lot of legwork for him to have to do that. It does need congressional approval, and it does need to be voted from 38 states out of 50, I think. So is there a strategy there?
As you say, Trump has teased this idea for quite a while. He's handed out Trump 2028 hats at the White House. Even back in 2019, he posted a video of an edited version of Time magazine with imaginary campaigns for 2024, 2028 and onwards. So, as you say, the 22nd Amendment limits him to 2 terms only, which was ratified in 1951 in response to Franklin D. Roosevelt having gone against the tradition of presidents only serving 2 terms. But Steve Bannon gave this interview to The Economist, claiming there was a plan to circumvent the 22nd Amendment, and he said Trump is going to be president in 28 and people ought to just get accommodated with that. And at the appropriate time, we'll lay out what the plan is. But then Bannon hasn't worked in the Trump White House since 2017. Does he really know what Trump is thinking? And also that gave rise to speculation that Trump would run as someone's vice and then step into the role, because the 22nd Amendment doesn't say anything about succession, just election. And Trump's so on Monday, as you say, he said it would be too cute, it wouldn't be right. There's another element here, which is that the 12th Amendment says no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president. And then on Tuesday, Speaker Mike Johnson said he'd talked to Trump about the constrictions of the Constitution, as he put it, and he said he didn't see a way to amend the Constitution. He said it would take about 10 years, that he didn't see a path. So then yesterday, Trump seemed to walk back on this idea and said, it's pretty clear I'm not allowed to run, it's too bad. In terms of the options for doing this legally, constitutionally, trying to circumvent the barriers that exist, the most obvious one would be repealing the 22nd Amendment. The Constitution requires, as you say, that an amendment to do so be proposed by 2/3 of the House and Senate, which the Republicans don't have, or a Constitutional Convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. It's up to the states to approve a new amendment, with 3/4 voting to ratify it, but the Democrats currently control 18 of the 50. Alternatively, there has been some talk that Trump could somehow get himself anointed Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then he'd be next in line after the Vice President. But then you've got to persuade a President and a Vice President to stand down. And the Guardian newspaper had a suggestion that he could maybe even declare a state of emergency and postpone the 2028 election. But he'd criticised Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, as a dictator for postponing elections. And that was under the very real conditions of war and martial law. But then when did Trump let past thoughts and statements get in his way? But there are also other challenges. Trump is currently 79 years of age. We saw last year with Biden the dangers that can arise with an older president. Trump has already given a very rambling performance to assembled generals back in September. This month, the Democrat Madeline Dean confronted Speaker Johnson and said the president's unhinged, he's unwell. And Johnson didn't actually contest that. He just said a lot of folks on your side are too, so nothing comforting there. And then this week, Trump was talking about an IQ test, but based upon the content, it seemed more to be a dementia test. And there's also, I think, political challenges to the vice president idea. If you are, say, JD Vance or Marco Rubio, you've accepted a job in this administration partly because you want to enjoy a powerful position now, but also partly to position yourself for a future race and show that you've got what it takes. So why agree to become president for a day or a week just to get Trump back in? Surely they have their own ambitions and their own policies and ideas they want to implement. Nobody wants to go down in history as the shortest serving president and be the answer to that particular pub quiz question. So it would only have to be a real lackey or superfan who's willing to do it, maybe one of Trump's sons. And if you're the one who let Trump back in for a third term, you'll always have partial responsibility for anything he does during that term. And also, what if they did try and do the succession plan and the person then doesn't want to step down once they get in? There's no formal mechanism for Trump in the capacity as vice to demand that the president resign in his favour. And I think what's underlying all of this is, does he really want the third term? We know that Trump loves trolling the Democrats. He likes to keep people guessing. Him talking about this and speculating about this and then walking it back makes it a lot harder for the Democrats to plan their own strategy for 2028. And also, it helps build his public image as a president who won't be held back by others, who doesn't respect norms, who breaks the rules. We've seen with the state visit to the UK, he likes to be viewed as an exception. And also, that speculation about a third term postpones the moment at which he starts to become a second-term lame duck president. It stops the Republican Party shifting its attention away from him and planning a future that doesn't include him. So the idea of a third Trump term really keeps the spotlight on him. And it's also a very good way of distracting everyone from bad news as and when he feels like it. We saw this back in March with the Signalgate group chat leaks, that he then started talking about a third term and it distracted everybody. But I think underlying it, it might just be about attention. We know that Trump enjoys putting his ideas out into the world and seeing the reaction that he gets back. It could be that he's backing away from a third term now in the hope that his supporters demand, oh, no, you must run again. Either so he can enjoy people begging him to stay and just get that little dopamine hit in his brain, or because he's testing the waters and wants to be able to say, oh, I tried to back away from the idea, but the people just wanted me so desperately that I had to reconsider.
Just finally, Bethany, Donald Trump has been full steam ahead with this renovation at the East Wing to build the White House ballroom. Photos of the demolition have contradicted Trump's claim that the construction would be near the East Wing, but it wouldn't touch him. So photos surfaced showing that there had been more demolition than he had said. So he's been criticised for lack of transparency and for the lack of a public consultation on the building that, of course, has historical value because it's where the First Lady and her staff preside. So the White House has now fired all 6 members of a commission that would essentially review this construction project. So can you walk me through what's happened here?
So on Tuesday, the White House fired all 6 members of the Commission of Fine Arts. It's an independent federal agency that had expected to review some of Donald Trump's construction projects. So as you say, the renovations to the White House ballroom and also the arch that he's planning for next year to mark 250 years of American independence. There's usually a mix of architects and urban planners. The commission gives advice to the president, the Congress and officials. The ones he fired are Biden appointees. So a White House official said they would be replaced with members who are more aligned with President Trump's America First policies. This isn't entirely new. In 2021, Biden fired Trump appointees from the Commission of Fine Arts and also from the National Capital Planning Commission. And at the time, Biden officials defended the move, saying it was about diversifying the panels. And it was also the first time in the Commission's history that a president had forced out sitting members. And then back in July, the White House fired the Biden appointees from the National Capital Planning Commission. So the White House has said that it will soon send Trump's ballroom plans to the National Capital Planning Commission, which will decide whether or not to approve the building. White House officials have not said whether they'll send the plans to the Commission of Fine Arts and whether they'll need approval from that agency for Trump's ballroom project. Although the Commission does tend to review projects, there is a historical precedent here if Trump did want to ignore them, because President Truman wanted a balcony back in 1947, and at that stage the then Commission chairman said the panel was advisory, so Trump might choose to take that same perspective in a bid to get the changes he wants to the White House. But he has already stacked the deck. It seems he's stacking the deck because he's fired these Biden appointees and is going to have people on his side, so he's very keen on those renovations.
Bethany Elliott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you so much for having me.